All right, we are ready to start the 2021 legislative session.
So welcome, everyone. Welcome to the 2021 Oregon legislative session, Advancing Affordable Housing Through a Time of Crisis. And my name is Brian Hoop, Executive Director of Housing Oregon. I'm excited to be joined by an amazing panel of state legislators and affordable housing advocates. But before we kick things off, I wanted to call your attention to and ask for you to take action, contacting Oregon's congressional delegation to support the inclusion of over $375 billion in housing and community development resources over the next 10 years in the Build Back Better agenda being deliberated right now in Congress. To put that dollar figure into perspective, HUD's annual budget is currently only about $50 billion. These are all critical housing resources that are long overdue. Some particularly important programs in that $375 billion package include $90 billion rental assistance, $80 billion to address public housing capital needs, $10 billion for first-time homebuyer down payment assistance support, and $17 billion for the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, a tax credit to fill appraisal gaps for single-family homes in distressed areas. Our national advocacy partners are regularly reaching out with sign-on letters to demand housing be included in the Build Back Better agenda. I will post a link in the chat box encouraging organizations to sign on to a letter crafted by LISC, the Local Initiative Support Corporation, and NACEDA, the National Alliance of Community Economic Development Associations, to Senator Wyden. Of course, Senator Wyden is already a staunch housing supporter, and his DASH Act, which he will be speaking about tomorrow at our conference at 12 noon, overlaps significantly with the Build Back Better agenda. But it's critical to remind him how important it is to include housing and the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act in the final version of the Build Back Better Act. The NHIA Act provision, as currently included in the Build Back Better Act, would result in approximately 500,000 homes built or rehabilitated, creating a pathway for more families to buy a home and start building wealth. And lastly, I'll also include a link to the National Low-Income Housing Coalition's Housed campaign, where you can send an email to your congressional delegation, reminding them of the importance of ensuring any cuts to the Build Back Better Act do not come at the expense of affordable, accessible homes for America's lowest income and most marginalized people. So now to shift back to introduce our panelists for this session, I am pleased to introduce our moderator, Nicole Stingh, who is Assistant Director of Government Relations at Oregon Housing and Community Services.
Thank you, Brian, and hello, everyone. Brian, I appreciate you taking the time to highlight the need to reach out to our federal delegation about the Neighborhood Investment Act and the incredible resources that could come to Oregon. It's vital that Congress keep up with our state legislature in increasing housing resources, and we know that we have strong leadership in DC that is interested in housing solutions. As Brian mentioned, my name is Nicole Stingh. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Assistant Director of Government Relations at Oregon Housing and Community Services. Today, we have a wonderful topic at hand. We'll be discussing the historic investments and policy coming out of the 2021 session. This session, legislators saw a community in crisis and they acted, passing policies to keep Oregonians in their home, address long-standing racial disparities in housing access and outcomes, and doubling or sometimes tripling investments in housing solutions. If you had a hard time keeping up with this session, it's not surprising. We have a panel of leaders here to get you up to speed, reflect on the challenges and accomplishments of the legislative session, and take your questions. Before I turn things over to our panelists to introduce themselves, I'm going to drop a summary of investments to Oregon Housing and Community Services in the chat that details those historic investments that we'll dive into more today. But before we begin with questions, I will turn things over to the panel to introduce themselves, starting with House Housing Chair Julie Fahey. Chair Fahey, take it away.
Thanks, Nicole. I am State Representative Julie Fahey. I am in my third term in the legislature representing West Eugene and Junction City. Soon to be in a new district representing West Eugene and Veneta, but for now, West Eugene and Junction City. I was named the chair of the House Housing Committee last May at the beginning towards the beginning of the pandemic, and have really appreciated the teamwork that comes with doing all the policy and investment work that we're doing, and in a team-oriented approach. For me, it's getting the chance to work with Senator Jama on the Senate side and all of the housing advocates in Oregon. I really feel like we have done some great work over the last 18 months. So Nicole, I wasn't sure if you wanted us to just do brief introductions or.
Representative, brief introductions are great. We have a few planned questions, and we'll try to save some time for audience questions as well. So I'll go ahead and now turn it over to Senator Kayse Jama to introduce himself. Senator Jama is the chair of the Senate Housing Committee. So Senator Jama, please take it away.
Thank you, Nicole, and good to see you, Chair Fahey, as well. Again, my name is Senator Kayse Jama, District 24. I came to this position through appointment just January, just before the session started, and I became the housing chair on the Senate side as well, and same time in January. So I've been in the job about now 9 months, and had a great session, and really agree with Chair Fahey that this really has been amazing collaboration work, and this is not only those folks who are here today, but really there is a really great advocacy around this issue that has been both in the legislative side and also the community side that has been really pushing this issue forward. So it's all teamwork. I agree with that.
Thank you, Senator. I will now turn things over to Alison McIntosh, who leads the Oregon Housing Alliance. Alison is a staunch advocate for affordable housing and for the communities we serve. Alison, go ahead.
Thanks, Nicole. Thanks so much for having me here. My name is Alison McIntosh. I use she, her pronouns, and I work for an organization called Neighborhood Partnerships, and my role there is to convene the Oregon Housing Alliance. It's a coalition of about 90 organizations that believe everyone deserves a safe, stable, and affordable place to call home, and are very lucky to get to work with housing providers, social service providers, food banks, local governments, and other advocates to bring an agenda to the legislature every year, and really honored to work with Chair Fahey and Chair Jama.
Thank you, Alison. And when I said we had a rock star panel, I was not kidding. These are some of the best housing minds we have in the state who helped shepherd what is an incredible investment this legislative session. As I mentioned, we entered this legislative session after a year that was devastating to Oregonians, from the health and economic impacts to COVID and the Labor Day wildfires. Oregon communities have been desperate for recovery. And we must recognize that Black, Indigenous, and people of color have been disproportionately impacted by the challenges of 2020. Now, to the panel, how do these concurrent crises impact the legislature's response to Oregon's housing crisis? In what ways did these crises elevate the focus and legislators' attention to the issues of housing affordability, homelessness, and the longstanding racial inequity? And whoever wants to dive in first, it's a meaty question.
I can go ahead and quickly start, and then also if I address folks, at least in my perspective as a new legislator, have been a housing advocate for almost as long as I've been in Oregon. Although this issue is not new to me, it's a very, very complex issue, as you all know. And to your questions, Nicole, in terms of how this elevated this issue during the COVID-19, I think we all know that we're already struggling as a state in terms of facing home supply shortage, as well as renters who are struggling to pay their rent, and overall also just the disparity between home ownership between people of color, BIPOC community, as well as their counterparts. So this has been an ongoing historical issue as we go, as we work together. The reality is that COVID-19 really amplified and really make that challenge even more clearer. So there's no question about, if you see streets in Portland, in Eugene, in Salem, you see the challenge we're facing as a community, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. And of course, you added on top of that the wildfire that happened the last year and this year. So it's really, the issue is complex, as I said earlier. In terms of what we have been doing and how that related around racial justice and make sure that there's a really more investment in this issue, the legislators really did a very tremendous investment this session. We spent $765 million of investment throughout the session, and that is a historic investment. Having said that, whether that's addressing issues of home ownership, whether it's through the building new supplies of housing, whether it's through addressing racial disparities, whether it's through the rental assistance programs like SB 282, as well as protections around 278 that those two bills provide for those who are struggling to pay their rent in Oregon. Those has been some amazing things we have done, but that's not enough as we all live this issue. And this is not going to be addressed just only on Oregon, but I believe this has to be also a federal issue as well. As folks where Brian was talking about the new investment from federal government, it has to be really all hands approach and both federal and the state level. And that's really where I want to end up this conversation. So I'm glad we're talking about this.
Yeah, I would agree with Senator Jama about the piece of, we knew we had, I sometimes call it a pre-existing housing crisis before heading into the pandemic, right? Major pieces of legislation in the 2019 session around tenant protections and housing supply. We knew this has been a crisis for many years, and the legislature has been focused on that crisis. And then the pandemic hit and the wildfires and thousands of people losing their homes. And I think that there was both an immediate challenge associated with keeping people housed during the pandemic and, making sure wildfire recoveries were housed and could rebuild, wildfire victims were housed and could rebuild. And then there was also an opportunity that some of the federal funding brought. So in terms of the challenge, I personally feel as if the last year and a half, the vast majority of my time has been focused on that challenge of keeping people housed during the pandemic. Last year, we had a special session in June to codify the eviction moratorium that in the governor's executive order. We worked on allocating state dollars for rental assistance. We had another special session in December that extended that moratorium and allocated additional funding, created the landlord compensation fund and additional tenant-based funding. So last year was sort of all focused on keeping people housed during the pandemic. And of course, this session, we continued that focus, passed an extension of the foreclosure moratorium, and as Senator Jama mentioned, passed additional tenant protections in Senate Bill 282 and Senate Bill 278 that gave tenants, after the moratorium expired, gave tenants extra time to pay their back rent and provided for a 60-day pause. So that I do feel like those crises have changed our focus in that we shifted a bit away from the overall challenge of fixing the housing supply issue and the housing crisis in Oregon towards the immediate crisis. And also there was opportunity that came with federal money from coronavirus relief, the American Rescue Plan. We were able to innovate in some ways. So Project Turnkey, which was a project that was created so that distressed hotels and motels could be purchased and converted into shelters and hopefully long-term affordable housing. And there were, as Senator Jama said, $765 million invested in housing this year is in a combination of state and federal funding, which was over $550 million of that was for affordable housing construction, preservation and land acquisition. So crisis can sometimes bring opportunity and in addition to the challenges that it faced. So I do think we made some meaningful progress on addressing Oregon's housing crisis, despite all of the challenges that the pandemic and the wildfires have brought.
I would echo those comments. Absolutely. I think we all know that before the pandemic, communities all across the state, BIPOC communities, low-income communities were experiencing incredible housing challenges and have been for decades. And the pandemic was a moment where it clarified something all of us already knew, which was how critical housing stability is for every other facet of everyone's lives, right? All of a sudden we found ourselves sheltering in our homes, and it really clarified for so many other people what it meant to be safe and stable in your housing. And I think I can't thank the legislature and the governor enough for all of the incredible work they've done over the last 18 months from the beginning of the pandemic, really focusing on housing stability for renters, for homeowners, investments in shelter and support for folks experiencing homelessness. I think I would just highlight a few other things. We know that communities of color have been experiencing housing disparities across the continuum. People of color experience worse outcomes when they experience homelessness in their experience as renters. They have lower rates of homeownership, all because of systemic and institutional racism and the things that are baked into our system to create and maintain those disparities. And it is going to take intentional and focused work to address and undo those disparities and create opportunity for BIPOC communities. And I think that work is going to be significant and long, but I think the legislature took a few important steps forward this session, really led both by the BIPOC caucus and the Governor's Racial Justice Council. I would just highlight a few pieces of legislation. Senate Bill 291, which creates a requirement for individualized assessment for folks with criminal histories. We know there's huge disparity in the ways that communities of color experience the criminal justice system. That will give people a second chance at housing. And then 2 task forces, a task force to address racial disparities in homeownership and a task force to look at racial disparities in homelessness, both of which will be underway soon.
Thank you all. I think one kind of nail on the head for me from these responses was what Representative Fahey said, that the legislature was in many ways distracted by these emergencies and these crises, and at the same time made incredible progress advancing some solutions on long-term problems. And I want to dig in a little bit more on one of those long-term solutions. Alison talked a lot about some of the work to address long-standing disparities in housing, and we all know housing has long been a place where discrimination and prejudice has had the most impact. Can you share a little bit more about your reflections on legislation aimed at closing the racial wealth gap, the racial wealth gap certainly, and also racial inequities in accessing affordable housing and addressing disparities in homelessness and in closing the racial disparities in homeownership for communities of color?
I'm happy to start. So, there are a number of pieces of legislation were already mentioned. I think it's very clear, anytime anyone who does housing policy work and pulls on any thread of sort of why things are the way they are today comes back to racism in housing. So we can go back to obviously racially restrictive covenants in housing deeds, single family zoning that was designed to keep neighborhoods exclusive. All of these legacy housing policies in the past have continued to have reverberations and impact today on the rates of homeownership amongst people of color and just general housing stability issues. And so it is something that the legislature has been extremely focused on. There was a task force set up a few years ago on racial disparities in homeownership that has put forward some recommendations, some of which were adopted in the legislation in the legislative session this year. And so there's the policy front. Alison mentioned Senate Bill 291, which will hopefully reduce barriers to people who have a history with our justice system. There's the task force on, again, re-upping the task force on closing racial disparities in homeownership. I will say that one of the pieces that I want to highlight is some of the investments that were made. We allocated about $2 million to provide technical assistance and outreach to culturally specific organizations to help reduce barriers to homeownership. And then an additional $20 million for down payment assistance, half of which will be to a revolving loan fund to help home buyers with secondary loans, and half of which is to culturally responsive community organizations to help increase homeownership opportunities. So I think those the policy work that we do, Representative Meek brought forward a bill about banning love letters from banning realtors from passing along love letters from buyers so that sellers won't have, racial, won't be taking into account prohibited characteristics when they're deciding on the buyers are. That policy work is really important. And we actually have to make investments to help change the way things are right now. And so those investments in helping more people of color become homeowners, I think is really important.
I think I would just want to quickly add, I echo what Chair Fahey said. I think definitely in the passing Senate Bill 291 and also House Bill 2007 and SB 79, which already, as she said, about making sure that we reduce the home ownership in our community, is really important point of that needs to be mentioned. I think for me, it's issues we have to really zoom back and really sit back and look bigger picture. The reality is that the housing disparity in our state and racial disparity has been ongoing issue for a long time. And although we made some progress this session, I think it has to be seen as a long-term strategy to address those racial disparities issue. If you look to 282, 278, those are programs who are creating rental assistance for those who are struggling to pay their rent during the COVID-19. Those even shows that folks who are buyback community members are disproportionately impacted in terms of their ability to pay their rent. So all of that said, I think as a state, we need to really go as a holistic approach and make sure that we reduce both home ownership, but also as well as making sure that renters are protected as we move forward together. So that's really for me where the two areas that comes closer together in terms of racial justice issues.
Absolutely. I think we both need to make sure that we're addressing explicit disparities and also providing assistance and support and protection and resources to BIPOC communities and places where we know there are disparities, right? And pay really specific and explicit attention to how we close those disparities. I think we've highlighted a lot of good things that happened. I think the only thing that I would add is one of the other exciting things that happened was a codification of the Governor's Racial Justice Council. So that body is now in statute and will have, I think, input and a way to explicitly engage in the governor's budget process, which is going to start next spring for the 2023-25 biennium. I can tell Nicole is so excited to start that work already. But that's really important to start thinking about how the state spends its resources and how we use those resources to support communities and to address disparities. And we start from the beginning to think about how do we reduce disparities in our system? So I'm excited to see the shape that that work takes and excited that the legislature codified that body.
I just want to jump in and add, I totally agree with Allison. One sort of, I don't want to say under the radar, but sort of under the radar thing that the legislature did that I don't think has gotten as much attention as we dedicated $4.8 million to fair housing enforcement and education. That is, and that's going to BOLI, the Bureau of Labor and Industries, the DOJ, and the Fair Housing Council of Oregon. That's a pretty sizable investment in something that I think has not gotten enough attention. And so I'm really excited to see what happens with that investment.
I think you're right that really did sneak under the radar, and I can say from my vantage point, obviously I'm very focused on investments that go through Oregon Housing and Community Services, but we really must and have to look at housing as a broader spectrum, not just the investments to Oregonians in need, but also looking at the system as a whole. And a key part of that system is the overall supply of housing. We all know that Oregon has a severe housing shortage. A lack of housing shortage. And we know that hundreds and thousands of homes need to be developed for the Oregonians currently living in our state. So as we work on investments to address disparities, help Oregonians afford and achieve home ownership and stay stably housed, what are some of the policies or investments that help the overall supply that you're particularly excited about? What are those future opportunities for furthering housing supply that you're also looking at for the potential 2023 session?
I can start again, but the next question, someone else has to go first. So this is, I get very excited about housing supply issues. It's the, I would say the root of how I entered the housing policy space in the legislature is what do we need to do to make sure we're building enough housing to meet the needs of Oregonians? And we're building on a pretty strong legacy of that in Oregon, where in 2017 we passed the ADU bill, Senate Bill 1051, and in 2019 we passed House Bill 2001 around middle housing and zoning. And so, coming into this session, I was really worried that with the ongoing crises of the pandemic, we would sort of take our foot off the gas on housing supply related issues, because it is, of course, the root of our housing affordability challenges in Oregon. We need to build more than 100,000 housing units just to meet the current need. And so I do think we did make some meaningful progress related to supply in this session. Obviously, the investments that we talked about in terms of just the overall number of investments in affordable housing development, preservation, and land acquisition. But we also passed some meaningful policy bills. So Senate Bill 8, we passed a couple of bills that will expedite the setting of affordable housing projects. Senate Bill 8 is one of them, about bypassing zoning obstacles to building affordable housing. And then another one, House Bill 2008, that will break down some barriers for religious organizations to build affordable housing on their land. We also had a long, great process for developing a bill about citing ADUs in rural areas. I think that was a great example of bipartisan cooperation and collaboration to get that done. And of course, a bill brought by Habitat for Humanity on lot splitting for middle housing. I think both Senate Bill 8 and the lot splitting bill have info sessions later in the day if you're interested in learning more about that. So I think we did make some significant progress on those in it from a policy perspective. In addition to the investments, a couple of supply related investments that I want to highlight personally, just because I think they're really innovative and great, is we funded an accessory dwelling unit construction pilot project to help lower income Oregonians who are homeowners construct ADUs on their property, either to house family members or to use as a source of rental income. I love ADUs, I'm sort of a housing nerd in that way, and then I love ADUs. I think they're just such a great, they're not going to solve the housing crisis on their own, of course, nothing is, but they're such a great thing to encourage. And I've been really encouraged by some of the work that cities are doing around that. And then also, we have an organization here in Lane County called Square One that is doing some really innovative work around shared equity homeownership, which is just an entirely different way of thinking about homeownership and homeownership opportunities for lower and middle income Oregonians. So those two things are great. I think you also asked about future issues, but maybe I'll have other folks reflect on the current session, and then we can move on to what's next.
I think for me, just to add what Chair Fahey said, that the $410 million that we invested LIFT program, which I think, Nicole, you are very familiar with, has been really great investment for, and will help the, help more new homes being built in Oregon. Having said that, I think the area that I feel like the most improvement that we need to do is around home ownership assistance programs. I think we invested a lot, but we need to invest more. I'll give you an example. Actually, I always say that I'm an example of that program's success because, as someone who's been here 22 years in Oregon, and home ownership was out of reach in my own personal experience, in my own family. Home ownership assistance programs were what was able to help me to, get kind of first step at the door and buy my own home first time as a home ownership. And really that program really was the success, because otherwise I was unable to definitely would come up with the down payment and all that goes into there. But the whole thing about how challenging that piece has been is important. And so I'm a big fan of it, really encouraging that we can create as many people can access to help to get home ownership. It will be important. But we know that not everybody wants to own a home. So I think if we also increase the rental availability market and really make sure there's an affordable rental market available for our community, it's really important piece of the equation that we need to address some of the housing challenges we're facing. So that's really for me the key elements that I will add to the conversation around, to your question.
Those are all really amazing things that have been highlighted. So many things, so many exciting things were accomplished in the 2021 legislative session. And like Chair Fahey said, right, we were both able to address what was happening currently right in front of Oregonians with the COVID pandemic, but we're also able to continue making really critical investments. I think I would just highlight, like Chair Jama said, the investment in LIFT and the $410 million in LIFT and permanent supportive housing was incredible, like just double the amount of resources that were committed the last biennium. And then I would be totally remiss if I didn't lift up the $100 million of preservation. That's like more resource than we've ever gotten cumulative total before for that. And it's so critical, right, to make sure that residents are living in safe and stable housing for the long term and that we maintain our affordable housing. So that was a huge, huge, exciting thing. And then lastly, I think I would just say, something that I really noticed both about housing advocates and the legislature was this desire to work on things that would make a difference in the short term, the medium term, and the long term, right? So House Bill 2001 was a great example of a really long-term trajectory from 2019, right? Really addressing critical rezoning and the supply of missing middle housing. This session, we saw the same thing, right? Senate Bill 8, Senate Bill 458, really long-term view bills that will make a difference of this really long trajectory, really critical, but also investments that will help in the medium term and critical investments in like short-term emergency, addressing those emergencies. So, thanks.
Thanks, all. And now I'll turn to the second part of the question. Now, I think the investments and the progress are incredibly exciting, especially given everything else the legislature had on its table on its plate this year. But also there's more work to be done. And a person in the chat put down discussing the development of housing and communities focused on single family housing when housing needs analysis shows the deficit is in missing middle and multifamily housing. I'll open it up and maybe talk about what are some solution or some ideas, thoughts about where the legislature might go next in terms of strengthening the work of increasing missing middle and multifamily supply.
I probably would be Alison if you want to start. I could start, but honestly, like probably that would be the best. I'm new to this arena, so.
It's a great question. You know, I think so. In 2019, the legislature passed House Bill 2003, which looked at implementing a regional housing needs analysis and really like trying to be, and there are people who are in this room likely who are much smarter about this bill than I am. So if I get something wrong, put it in the chat. But you know, I think that is a really important next step, right? The House Bill 2003 in 2019 was a first step. What would this look like? What are the strategies that local governments need to adapt? Their DLCD has an amazing 20-page list of housing production strategies that local governments can adopt to meet needed housing goals. That's the first thing that I send local governments that ask me what can they do to address their affordable housing needs. But we actually need to take the next step now. So that was a kind of like a what would this look like? The legislature now needs to consider how do we adopt a regional housing needs analysis, and can we get to a place where we're actually holding cities accountable for the work that they're doing and the units that they are building or not building, and what are they doing? How are they reporting to the legislature and to the state about the strategies that they've adapted to make more needed housing available?
I would completely agree with that. I think, you know, House Bill 2001 had essentially said a very specific thing that we as the state think that cities need to do. And sort of pulling back, you know, in our land use system, generally communities have to have a plan, goal 10. They have to have a plan to encourage the availability of the adequate numbers of needed housing units, at price ranges and rent levels that are commensurate with the financial abilities, and they have to allow for flexibilities of housing location, type, and density. And so it's not just sort of, we throw out this 110,000 units piece. It's, as the person in the chat acknowledged, it's also, you have to have a diversity of type and density and location. So I think, as Alison said, the future is we have done some sort of telling cities what to do, and the future is, I think, how do we both help cities accomplish some of those strategies that are on that page that Alison's forwards. So how do we help them, either with technical assistance, resources, whatever that is, and then how do we hold them accountable for that? So I sort of have this philosophy about that our land use system says local governments are responsible for this, and some are doing better than others in terms of enacting those strategies. So that is definitely a piece of it in terms of what the future might look like. I also have one specific land use thing that I think we need to do a better job of is encouraging / allowing more density near transit stops in those areas that do have a reliance on transit, like where I live. So Representative Meek had House Bill 2558 this session, which would have required local governments to allow certain types of development within 1/8 of a mile of fixed transit stops. That bill did not pass. There might be a better way to do that, to encourage more density during near transit. But I do think we do have to reckon with the fact that housing density near our transit systems is something that we need to improve on. So not sure if 2558 was the right solution to that, but that is something we do have to focus on in the future, because everybody knows the benchmark of 30% of your income on housing, but there is, I think, more of an acknowledgement and shift that it really is housing plus transportation costs that matter. And locating housing near transit helps that remain affordable for people, and also, of course, helps achieve our environmental goals, which I know we care about as a Oregonians. So
I think for me, I'm not going to add anything more. This has already been said about, of course, the increasing the density of our just that really does what we need to go. But I think in terms of just overall, I think the way I see approach this housing issue is not like, for me, it's not about single standing issue. It's really, really interconnected. So you're talking about economic issues around and livable wages. If people are unable to afford building new housing, you can build as much as you want, but the reality is that if people cannot afford it, that's just not going to help anybody. If we don't address some of our mental health issues and homelessness issues, that you can build as many shelters as you want, but still people will be struggling. That's just the reality of that. So whether the mental health issues, economic justice issues around livable wages, environmental, all these components has to be looked at together collectively without looking one issue and not looking the other one, because they are interconnected. And that's really, for me, in long-term strategy, that's how I feel like we need to approach as a state and as a community in order to move forward collectively.
This is such a great discussion. I'm going to dive a little bit deeper in it. So before I dive in, I might take the privilege of having the mic and share that we at OHCS are working with our partners at the Department of Land Conservation and Development, DLCD, on continuing the work of the Regional Housing Needs Analysis, and we'll be putting together a stakeholder group to specifically dive into some of these questions. There's a very interesting question that's posed in the chat that I'd love to get this panel's thoughts on, and that's relating to the model of how we built our regional housing needs analysis, looking at our neighbor to the north. The question is wondering if you all are giving thought to tying transportation funds to housing goals as outlined by localities in House Bill 2003, something similar to what the California Housing Accountability Law does. I'm not sure if this is not something I remember explicitly from the legislative conversations, though I know these were conversations that were had when the bill was first discussed in 2019. So I'll open it to you all to answer that very detailed question.
I think I would just say that we're in the early stages of thinking about what that accountability might look like, right? And so there was an investment this session to, as Nicole said, to start that conversation and to say, okay, now we have the data on the regional housing needs. Now what? How can we move forward with, as I said, both that, how do we help local governments achieve what they need to achieve, and how do we hold them accountable? So, you know, that is certainly an interesting idea and one that we'll take into account. And I think we're in the early stages of having those conversations about what that could or should look like. Someone early on, so another legislator, when I first started getting into housing issues, said, we need to figure out how to put teeth in goal 10. And I didn't know what that meant when I was when I was a freshman legislator, and now I care about that quite a bit. So it's funny how much of a difference 4 years can make.
I guess I would say, and so I think this conversation about both how are we putting in place metrics and strategies so that we're both measuring progress at the local government level and at the state level and at the regional level. And how are we supporting local governments? We know that there are a ton of local governments that know that they have housing needs in their community and they want to figure out how to address it. And our cities, like many areas of government, don't have the resources and capacity that they need to address these problems. So for cities who want to do this work, how do we support them? And for the cities who may be reticent, how do we hold them accountable, right? And I think making sure that we're doing that, putting some teeth in goal 10, like Rep. Fahey said, and then a little bit of a tangent, but I guess I would just say, we know that our current system has resulted in racial inequities and segregation in all of our communities and a lack of safe and stable housing for people with low incomes. Anything that keeps and reinforces the status quo and how we've been doing things, whether that is siting and design standards, whether that is density standards, whether that is local inability or unwillingness to fund affordable housing, that just reinforces this disparity and this status quo and this segregation. And it is on all of us, whether we are an advocate or a developer or a city planner or a city elected official, to challenge all of the places where those things appear. We have to do things differently. We cannot allow the status quo and the inertia of the status quo to keep us from building the housing that we need. That is the place where like NIMBYism thrives, right? In the status quo and all the rules and all the, you have to have X many trees and your driveway has to be X many feet wide and whatever other examples are. Those are the things that we need to, at every level, not just the state telling local governments what to do, but from local governments and neighborhoods, and everybody needs to be challenging all of those current patterns of the way that we work. So that's my soapbox.
Alison, I'll just jump in, Senator Jama, I know you want to get in, but I am amazed that I managed to make it 44 minutes into a housing panel without saying the status quo is not working, because that is the thing that I say most often. The status quo is not working for Oregonians on housing. And so that is the thing that I want people to take away, that how we are doing things now, there are positives and negatives to that, but it is overall not working for too many Oregonians.
And I actually will second that as well. I think that's really the reality, is that, yeah, absolutely, I agree with that statement. I think for me, the question earlier been asked, my take on is that I think we need to do all hands approach. The strategies around that might work, we have to localize issues, right? Like, so what works on Portland, Oregon might not work in Medford, Oregon. Or Eugene or Redmond, Oregon. So I think there's a way piece of around, well, if transportation investment might look like different in Portland than it looks like in Medford, Oregon or Eugene. So I think we have to really look localizing while we're also focusing around strategy around statewide. So those are really things that tensions that we always talk about it. But I think that's how I will be approaching that question, by making sure that we focus local, but also strategize statewide.
Thank you. I think we could continue discussing land use and ways to improve housing supply, but I'm going to go ahead and shift it over to audience questions. There's a few audience questions in the chat. If you have other questions, please do put them in the chat. But this one, Representative Fahey, was directed to you. What is needed or most helpful for moving cooperative housing options forward and building on the funding for it in the recent budget?
Thanks for that question. I get really excited about some of the alternative ways of doing things. I mentioned the limited equity shared ownership pilots that we funded in the legislature this year. And I actually just visited the opening of a middle housing project in Springfield where there's 5 housing units on one property, and it will be co-op sort of shared ownership and limited equity piece. So that to me is really interesting, but right now it's sort of in the pilot phase, right? That we are funding some of these projects around the state as a way to sort of prove that they can be an effective way to provide homeownership opportunities for lower income Oregonians. So that piece in particular, I think is sort of, we're funding it, we're seeing how it works. I hope that there are more opportunities for funding in the future, or perhaps we can come up with a dedicated program, something like that. For co-op ownership more generally, you know, I said I got into housing issues because of the issue of supply. It's actually not technically true. I really got into housing issues because I have one of the highest number of constituents living in mobile home parks of any legislator in the state. And so I, in the process of going door to door and getting elected, talked to many people who live in mobile home parks, some of which are, most of which in my district are not co-op owned, and are, facing really increasing challenges from the out-of-state corporations and private equity firms that are coming in and buying up the parks and increasing rents, cutting services, those types of things. So it is mobile home, in my mind, mobile home park co-op ownership, where the residents band together to buy their park and operate it as a co-op, is a successful model that is out there right now about how residents can come together and operate things as co-ops, and that we don't need a pilot. It's already happening and it's already working. And it is a successful way to sort of combat those market forces that are happening right now, that are where you have these captive audiences of folks in mobile home parks. So that is really exciting to me when I see it. We have made investments in the legislature in helping organizations like Kayse of Oregon and financial assistance for tenants who want to come together and buy their parks. It's not enough. And then this year I put forward and passed a bill that makes it easier for mobile home park tenants to come together, remove some barriers that tenants were facing to come together and buy their parks. So that was another piece of the puzzle as well. So I guess from a broader perspective, the co-op work is happening in these specific niche pockets of mobile home parks, this type of shared ownership, home ownership opportunities. But we do need to be thinking more broadly and more generally about how do we expand co-op ownership types, more broadly in the state.
Thank you, Representative. That's a wonderful response. And I might just flag for those of you that are following OHCS and our funding frameworks and funding calendar closely, you might be aware that for LIFT homeownership, of which we received quite a bit of resource in this last session, we are considering ways to use that resource to build new manufactured home parks. So it's a big legal question, but we talked to our council about that last month, or actually just a week ago at the October Housing Stability Council meeting. So just a flag, if folks are interested in engaging more at the implementation level, we always invite feedback and are eager for your experience. I think we have time. Oh, my apologies. Go ahead.
Jump for the co-op model, just to add to that. Actually, for me, another area that I think we should continue to explore more is a land trust issue model, which really for me, I'll tell you, I don't know how many of you here know that, for example, as someone who's come from a Muslim background, some of the folks who are Muslim, practicing Muslim, cannot pay interest rates in terms of, so they're for much that they're out of the housing market. So Those communities like that maybe have some either religious or cultural or whatever issue barriers to go to the home ownership. Land trust may be a model that they can potentially may be able to explore to get into the housing and have a stable homes. So that's kind of another area that I want to highlight.
Thank you, Senator. And certainly land trust models are very important. I noticed we have some friends with Proud Ground here in this call today, so I want to call out them and their incredible work. I think we have time for just one more question, and this is another meaty one. It's relating to housing first models. The question is, what barriers exist for effective implementation of housing first policy at a large scale, such as what the state of Utah was able to do? Have housing advocates and homelessness advocates in Oregon been pushing for such a solution? So Alison, I might turn this question over to you first for potentially some historical advocacy information.
Sure, absolutely. And I will just say, this is a little bit of an aside. I grew up in Salt Lake and my family still lives there. And I will say, while Utah did incredible work to fund a housing first model, they did not maintain it. And people are now experiencing homelessness who were stable in housing. And I think that is really critical, right? If we are asking the state to fund a housing first program, we absolutely have to figure out how to advocate for its continuance, because we cannot build permanent supportive housing and then walk back those commitments. It is a long-term project, right? And rent assistance and services needs to be there for those projects, and particularly for those people for as long as they need that housing. So my personal criticism of that effort aside, I think I think certainly the Housing Alliance believes in housing first, and the legislature has funded permanent supportive housing in both 2019 and 2021. The legislature put general obligation bonds as well as rent assistance and service dollars into Oregon Housing and Community Services budget and OHA's budget, but I think we're going to figure out how to consolidate that so it's a little bit easier. I know the department has been working to develop a permanent supportive housing institute. This work is not easy, right? Developing relationships between housing providers, property managers, mental health providers, healthcare providers, right? You need to bring all of these things together to really serve people who need permanent supportive housing. And I think it's important to be really thoughtful, and it's important to be bold and to think about more significant investments in that work as we build the capacity around the state to build this type of housing. So I think Oregon is taking some really important and smart steps to go further into that work, and it will be up to advocates and others to carry that work forward and to make sure that we're continuing to increase those investments, and that we're fighting to keep those rent assistance and service dollars whole every biennium.
I do have anything and much to add to what Alison said, but I think definitely the strategy around housing first is an important one. But I think, as she mentioned as well, ensuring that there is a wraparound services that are available people as they move to the stable homes is really critical, important issue for me. So addressing the fundamental issues of housing needs is important, but having really around how do you address the mental health issues, how do you address the lack of home ownership. Those all elements are connected with each other, as I said earlier. So I think that really strategy is important one, but I think we need to do more deeper and really focus more holistic approach overall.
Yeah, and I agree with all of that. And again, also with the emphasis on housing first, and also Alison's point about how, yes, we need to make more investments in the housing first model and in permanent supportive housing. And even if we said, here's $5 billion for that, do we have the infrastructure in place, the providers, the developers, to actually that up to scale right now? There is sort of a limiting factor there in terms of the people and the land and the availability to actually do that work and build those projects. I will highlight, I mentioned early on, I think Project Turnkey, which we set up and funded during the pandemic, modeled after California's model, Home Key, I think was their name. is a really interesting and innovative approach. Setting funding aside to be able to purchase distressed hotels and motels during the pandemic and convert those into shelters. And we're hoping in many cases then permanent housing. So that was an innovative, creative way of thinking about how do we add units really quickly. I will say that just as sort of a closing comment on issues of homelessness and affordable housing, it is really important for all of the advocates like you on this Zoom call right now to be thinking about sharing success stories with legislators and with your local communities and your neighborhoods. I know there was a mention of NIMBYism in the chat and in I think maybe in Allison's comments, but you are the folks who can help build the stories about why some of the things that state and local governments and nonprofits and advocates are doing are really important. What is this project of an affordable housing project in your community, and who did that help? We had a bill about Project Turnkey in the legislature this session, House Bill 3261, which would remove some barriers to converting hotels and motels into shelters or affordable housing. And there were some jurisdictions that didn't want those projects in their area. And so some legislators opposed those projects. None of us, here on this panel, of course, but because we get it. But it is really important to be sort of telling the stories and doing the advocacy about how this is a challenge that we all need to pitch in to address. Every community, every neighborhood, and so that that communications work about why this is important, so that there aren't those barriers to actually citing the projects when the funding is available, when all the stars align and the funding is there and the people are there and the developers are there. If a community or a neighborhood opposes it, that can be the death knell for a project. So I take it very seriously, my role, not just as policy wonk in the legislature, but also in trying to shift the hearts and minds of communities about what we actually need to do to solve our housing crisis here in Oregon.
Thank you, Representative. What a strong ending statement for this panel. I want to just highlight a few things. First of which, we talked a lot about Project Turnkey. The Oregon Community Foundation led that. Megan Loeb is in this room, so I want to extend my gratitude to her for that work and to her organization for leading that. Additionally, Kevin has dropped a survey form in the chat. Please evaluate this panel. Let us know what we could do differently next time. We're always open for improvement. And I might take, again, the privilege of moderator and just make one more appeal. What Representative Fahey said is so important. Legislators need to hear from you and to hear not only how these resources could better your community, but how they directly impact the lives of the people you serve or of your friends and neighbors. It is those stories that are most impactful in testimony. I think every time I get goosebumps when I'm listening to a hearing, it's always from a person telling their direct story. And I will also invite you to be in touch with Housing Oregon and with the Oregon Housing Alliance to learn how you can lend your voice to the effort of increasing housing supply. The historic legislative budget we have is due in large part and maybe potentially in full part to the advocates that are pushing for investments, and from the leaders like Representative Fahey and Senator Jama on this line, helping move their caucuses and their chambers forward in housing investments and policy solutions. So thank you all. Be sure to fill out that survey, and we appreciate your time this afternoon.